Shabbos Daf Yudches. We will begin with a Gemara immediately following the Mishnah, which began on the Daf previous, which discussed the machlokas between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai as to whether you are allowed to set up a malacha before Shabbos, which will continue to run over Shabbos. Now, our Gemara will begin by commenting on the machlokas of kneading, which seem to be mentioned in the Mishnah. The Gemara will try to discuss how exactly kneading is accomplished. The Gemara will have two machlokas on the subject. Then we will get into a list of various activities which we will find, which some of them are permitted to begin before Shabbos, even though they'll continue to run on Shabbos, and some of them you are not allowed to begin before Shabbos. And we're going to try to figure out who the author of this list is. The Gemara will try to say that it's really Beis Hillel with some exceptions, and then that it's really Beis Shammai with some exceptions. The Gemara will then move from there into the halachos of shehiyah, which is leaving a pan on the fire over Shabbos, because that is one of the halachas that will be mentioned on the list. And from there, the Gemara will begin a list of other similar discussions between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai about setting a goy in motion, doing a malacha, which appears to be in your instructions, and that will take us to a discussion of having a goy take care of your chametz for you before Pesach, which may appear as if you're not properly taking care of your chametz for Pesach. So let's begin. We had the Mishnah, which discussed a number of halachas that were set up to run before Shabbos. One of the halachas were that you are soaking water into soot to make ink. So the process was that you had the soot it was in the water, and then it soaked into the water. The water soaked into the soot for a while until ink was formed. There was a lengthy soaking process. Now the malacha that's involved there is the malacha of lush, which is technically defined as kneading. The concept of the malacha is that you are taking a disparate group of objects, like a powder, and you're making it into one lump, into one contiguous object or one continuous material. Meaning you are binding the pieces of the powder together with the water that it's being mixed into. So the Gemara notices over here that you're not actually mixing the soot with the water. You're just letting it soak. You're just placing the soot and the water together in a mixture. So the Gemara asks, where do you see that somebody holds that that's called lush? Lush, we understand that you're mixing it together. You're physically kneading the powder into the water to make the new material, to make the dough. But here you're just merely putting the liquid in. It binds together to a new mixture. But how do you know that that's a malacha of lush? So the Gemara quotes a machlokas, which we had between Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda. Rebbe says that if you put water into flour, you violate the Isser of lush on Shabbos. And Rabbi Yehuda says you do not violate it for that. So that would seem to indicate that our Mishnah, which says that just by placing water and soot together, you are doing a malacha, that would seem to be like the shita of Rebbe, who says that by putting water and flour, you've accomplished lush because it begins to bind it together even without being mixed. So the Gemara says, hold on a second, maybe Rabbi Yossi could also agree to this case. Rabbi Yossi said in the case of water and flour that it's not a malacha until you mix it. That's because water and flour together can form a very solid, thick mixture. It can form a dough. And that's only accomplished by kneading. If you just put the water and the flour together, you don't actually knead it, so that it only forms a loose mixture. That's not the ultimate mixture that you can form with this. So maybe that's why Rabbi Yossi says that doesn't count as the malacha. However, if you're forming a loose mixture, such as you're mixing soda with water, and that loose mixture is completely formed, as soon as you place them together without mixing, maybe Rabbi Yossi agrees that counts as the malacha of lush, since that's all you're actually intending to do. You just want to form that loose, flowy, liquidy mixture, and that is accomplished without having to mix anything. So Gemara says it can't be, because we have another brisa, which quotes the same people, Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda, and this one is the same machlokas. Rebbe says that you violate the malacha if you just put the water together with the afer, is what's quoted here. Afer is ashes. And Rabbi Yossi bar Rabbi Yehuda says you don't. Now, afer mixed with water only makes a loose mixture. So Gemara says maybe afer here, spelled with an aleph, is not really the correct reading. Maybe it's really referring to afar, spelled with an ayin. Now, afar refers to dirt. Dirt, when it's mixed with water, makes mud. Mud forms a thick mixture, and therefore you haven't really completed the mixing unless you've kneaded it. And maybe I could say the same thing. Rabbi Yossi says in this case you didn't do the malacha until you mix it. But in a case where you're forming a loose mixture, like the soot to make the ink, you do form the complete mixture when you just put the water and the soot together. You don't have to actually mix it. Gemara says, well, this only works if you want to reread the word Afer as Afar. But Afer and Afar are not the same thing. We have two brises, and one says the word Afer, one says the word Afar. And the fact that both are used separately indicates that they're different things. Gemara says, no, maybe they're two different brises by two different people. One was a collection of Rav Chia. One was from the collection of Rav Oishia's brises, and they use different words, but they're referring to the same thing. If it would be one brisa that used two different words, you'd have a point. It has to mean different things. But two brises by two people in two collections could use different words to refer to the same thing. The Gemara now quotes a brisa which has a list of 6 malachos which you may set up to do before Shabbos, which can run over Shabbos. 5 of them, the brisa tells us, is permitted to set up before Shabbos, and 1 of them is forbidden. And the Gemara will try to figure out, is this Beis Hillel with 5 permitted ones and 1 exception which is forbidden, or is it Beis Shammai? And you have to explain why the 5 that are permitted are permitted. The Gemara will then have another 5 halachas which it will quote afterwards, which will try to fit in with one opinion or the other. Okay, so the list of the 6 malachos are as follows. The first, we have the 5 that are permitted. They are, if you set up water to flow into a garden, meaning you channel a stream into the garden and it continues watering the garden on Shabbos, you set it up before Shabbos. Or if you set up spices to burn and impart a good smell in clothing, you set it up to burn before Shabbos, and the smell, the scent, soaks into the clothing over Shabbos. Or if you set up sulfur and ash to burn under your silver cups, which have a design on it, and the sulfur rising forms the blackening, the antiquing of the silver, and gives a nice relief to the design. That's the third one. The fourth one is if you put a special ointment on your eye to help it heal, and the fifth one is if you put a bandage on a wound to help it heal. These are 5 malachos which you can set up to run before Shabbos, and it's permitted to let them run over Shabbos. The 6th one is if you put wheat grain into a mill, which is set up on the side of a river, so that as the river flows, it turns the mill and grinds the grain. Are you allowed to do that on Shabbos? That the Brisa says no. So that's the only one that's forbidden. The other 5 are permitted. So now the Gemara wants to know, who is this? Is this Beis Hillel or is this Beis Shammai? Now Beis Shammai, we learned, says you're not allowed to set things up to run on Shabbos. Beis Hillel says you are. So the Gemara's first approach is to say, well, this is obviously Beis Hillel, and you just have to figure out why grinding grain in a watermill is forbidden. And the Gemara's first offering is Rabbah, and Rabbah says it's simple, because the mill makes a loud noise, and to set up a malacha which is going to run on Shabbos with a loud noise, like having your washing machine run on Shabbos, that's forbidden. Even Beis Hillel holds that that's also, because the fact that it makes a noise makes people think that you're actually using it and running it and doing a malacha on Shabbos. That's why that's forbidden. Now the Gemara quotes an approach brought by Rav Yosef, and Rav Yosef says that you're right, this is Beis Hillel, but the reason that Beis Hillel says that it's forbidden for the mill, the water mill, to run on Shabbos is because Beis Hillel hold that you may not have your possessions do work for you on Shabbos. That means, just as it's forbidden for you to work on Shabbos, and it's forbidden for your animals to work on Shabbos, that's a halacha called Shvisas Behemto. There's another halacha which we learn out of the pasuk of Achol Asher Amarti Aleichem Tishameru, that your objects, your possessions, may not actually do malacha for you on Shabbos. Okay, fine. That's why Beis Hillel holds you're not going to have the mill grind things for you on Shabbos. So now the Gemara is going to have a list of questions, because we saw in the Brisa that Beis Hillel permitted a number of things to happen, and we even saw in the Mishnah that a number of things were allowed to run on Shabbos. Why aren't those all called that your possessions are working for you? So the gist of the Gemara's answer will be that it's only called your possessions are working for you if something's moving, if it's actually doing work. So let's go through it slowly. The Gemara first asks, what about the cases in the Brisa of the spices that you're burning and the sulfur that you are burning, which then soak aroma or sulfur into your clothing or your silver? How come that's not a problem? Gemara says that's not called that your possessions are doing anything. There's a fire that's burning. Your objects are not actually doing any activity. It's not actually doing any work. Then the Gemara says, okay, but in the Mishnah we had the discussion of your oven. Your oven is heating flax to bleach the flax. There your oven's doing something. So Gemara says your oven's doing something, but there's nothing moving. Your oven's just sitting there and the fire is burning in it. That doesn't count as if your objects are doing something. Nothing's actually happening. And the Gemara says, okay, but what about the case of traps? We saw in the Mishnah that you're allowed to set up traps to catch animals, birds, fish before Shabbos. It's allowed to catch on Shabbos according to Beis Hillel. So over there, the trap's closed behind the animal that enters into it. Why is that permitted? So Gemara says it's a different type of trap here. We're discussing a passive trap, like a fish hook, that the fish just swallows the hook doesn't do anything, or a cone-shaped object that the animal or the bird or the fish enters it and its head gets stuck in the narrow end and it can't back out because there are spikes on this side. So here again, nothing moves. So this is the reason that Beis Hillel holds that all these do not violate the halacha that your objects may not do work for you. However, in the case of the mill, where the mill is actually moving and doing action, it's doing work, that's your possession, that's doing work for you, that's forbidden. Okay, now the Gemara has a third approach. And this is that this brisa here is not Beis Hillel at all. This brisa is actually Beis Shammai. And Beis Shammai says that you're not allowed to set anything up to run before Shabbos, and there's no difference whether it's moving, it's not moving. Your possessions are not allowed to work for you under any circumstances, any type of activity, moving or not moving. So the Gemara says, okay, well that's very nice, but there are 5 things in the brisa over here that are permitted. What's the reason? So the Gemara says because they're not actually in your possessions. The case of the fire is that the fire is just on the ground. It's not doing anything for you. It's not your action, it's not your possessions that are doing anything. The fire is just there on the ground. So Gemara now brings another case over here that Beis Shammai must certainly agree to. And there's actually 3 cases the Gemara brings. The Gemara assumes that Beis Shammai allows you to make beer. And now beer takes more than a week for the water to ferment the grain in the barrel. How come you're allowed to do that? If it takes more than a week, it obviously runs over Shabbos. In addition, we know that you're allowed to have a light in your house on Shabbos. How are you allowed to have a lamp that's burning on Shabbos? How are you allowed to have a pot that sits on the fire on Shabbos? All these things are malacha that's taking place. There's no actual action that's happening. How come all these things are allowed? And don't tell me that it's on the floor, because you can't. These things don't work on the floor. They only function in a container of some sort. So Gemara says, yeah, Beis Shammai will hold you're only allowed to do these things if you actually mafkir the object. You make it ownerless. You make it not yours. As long as it's yours, you couldn't do these things. It would violate the halacha that your kelim are not allowed to work for you. Now the Gemara quotes another brisa, and again we're going to try to figure out how this fits in with Beis Hillel or Beis Shammai. The brisa says the following thing. The brisa says you're not allowed to set up malachos to run over the entire Shabbos to be ready after Shabbos. It discusses a woman who wants to fill a pot with certain types of beans and grain that needs to cook for over 24 hours. She wants to set up just before Shabbos. It'll cook the whole Shabbos, it'll soak the whole Shabbos, and then it'll be ready after Shabbos. Similarly, a baker wants to have hot water after Shabbos so he could start to bake bread right away. He wants to put water in the oven at the beginning of Shabbos that it should stay hot the whole Shabbos and should be ready from after Shabbos. In both of these, it says you're not allowed to do it, and if you do it after Shabbos, you're not allowed to use it until enough time has passed to enable this entire accomplishment to be done after Shabbos, in order that you do not gain anything at all from the fact that this malacha ran over Shabbos. So Gemara says, so maybe you want to tell me that this has to be Beis Shammai, because according to Beis Hillel, there's no problem setting up malachos to run over Shabbos. The Gemara says no. This could even be Beis Hillel, and the problem with all these is not that malacha is running over Shabbos. The problem with all these is that there's something on a fire, and anytime you have something on a fire, we have a gzeira, a rabbinical decree. You may stir the coals in the fire. If you did that, it would cook faster, which is why you would want to do it. You would also violate the malacha of mavir, and possibly bishul, because you're making it cook faster and you're making the fire burn hotter. So Gemara says, okay, hold on a second, then let's go back to our brisa, where we had the case of smoking, the sulfur and the smoke and the scent in the clothing, the spices. How come you're allowed to do that? Now, we had one of the versions we understood that was Beis Hillel, who said you're allowed to do that. So Gemara says, no, over there you don't have to worry about him stirring the coals, because if he did, it would give off extra smoke, and that extra smoke would be destructive to the clothing that's being aromafied and to the silver. Gemara says, okay, but what about the Mishnah? In the Mishnah we had flax bundles are allowed to be bleached in the oven, but what about stoking the coals in the oven? Gemara says, no. People would never do that, because if you let a draft in on the flax, it'll destroy the flax. You can't open the oven in the middle and stir the coals. We have to remember the coals and the object that was being cooked or heated were in the same container. The ovens in the days of Chazal were a large clay cavity with fire in the bottom and whatever was being cooked in it with it. So Gemara says, okay, 1 second, there's another thing in the Mishnah. We had the case of cloth or wool being put into a vat of paint or a dye, and the dye soaked into the wool. So how are you allowed to do that? Those things were also hot. Shmuel says, you're right. If it would be on the fire, it would be forbidden, because you may come to stoke the coals. Must be talking about a case where you took the fire off. So Gemara says, but that doesn't solve the problem, because there's another thing you might do. You might stir the contents of the vat to help the dye soak into the wool, and that would also be a malacha. It could be that it would be bishul, it could be that it would be soveya, the dyeing. Gemara says, okay, so the situation is where it's off the fire and the cover is sealed on, so you couldn't possibly stir it and you couldn't possibly stoke the coals. Okay, now, based on this, the Gemara launches into a discussion of a number of halachos of shehiyah. Shehiyah is the isser, it's an isser d'Rabbanan, to leave a pot cooking on the stove on Shabbos, which you have the potential concern that you may stoke the coals, like we've seen up to now, and the Gemara will list a number of circumstances in which it's not a problem. Now, this is not the main discussion of this halacha. That appears later on Daf Chaf, and again on Daf Lamed Vav. So we will just mention these exceptions here. The Gemara first of all says exception number 1 to the isser to keep food on the fire over Shabbos is if the pot is very raw. There's raw food in the pot that will not possibly be ready on time for the evening meal, and it will definitely be ready on time for the morning meals. Therefore, there will be no reason for you to stoke the coals at any point. You could not possibly accomplish anything. You wouldn't make it ready for anything that it wouldn't have been ready for before. Now, therefore, you forget about it and you don't stoke the coals, and it's not a problem. As a matter of fact, you're even allowed to put a raw bone or piece of meat into a pot that's on the fire, and as long as that's in there, that would be a reason for you to not stoke the coals anymore. The Gemara says, by the same token, if you have a pot of fully cooked food, we'll see in the sugya later, possibly even if it's not fully cooked, if it's just edible, or if it's barely edible. But either way, if it's cooked and it's enough to be eaten, there's no problem. You may come to stoke the coals, and therefore would not be asked to leave it on the fire over Shabbos. Now, the Gemara says, here we have another discussion. We saw that the flax, you're allowed to have the flax in the oven because nobody will open the oven because it'll make a draft. So the Gemara says that certain types of meat will also be damaged by a draft. So the Gemara discusses 2 factors. What kind of meat do you have? Is it meat of a young kid, a goat, or is it the meat of an adult ram? Meat of an adult ram is tough, it will not be damaged by a draft. Meat of a kid is soft and will be damaged by a draft. Similarly, you have the question of, is the oven sealed with clay? If it's sealed with clay, that's something that'll block people from opening it up to stir the coals. And if it's not sealed, so then people may easily stir the Gemara therefore says we have 4 cases. If we're referring to soft kid meat, which could be damaged by a draft, and the oven is sealed up, we have 2 factors to prevent you from stirring the coals. If it's tough meat and the oven's not sealed, we do not have any factors to prevent you from stirring the coals. Or you could have 1 and 1. You could have tough meat with a sealed oven, or you could have soft meat with an unsealed oven. Now the Gemara says, and it has 2 versions of what the halacha is. The first version is that if you have both factors that are on your side to make it mutter, it's mutter. If you have both factors that are against you to make it usher, then it's usher. If you have 1 and 1, so then the machok is Rav Ashi and Rav Yirmiyah b'difti, whether it's mutter or it's usher. Rav Ashi says it's mutter, and Rav Yirmiyah b'difti says that it's usher. The Gemara quotes a Mishnah which says that it's forbidden to roast meat on Shabbos. The Gemara asks, how does this fit? The Gemara explains that's talking about a case where it is a older ram and it is not sealed, which means you have both factors to make it usher, and that's why this Mishnah says that it's usher, even according to Rav Ashi. The Gemara now has a second version of this exchange. According to this version, if you have any of the 3 cases where you have at least one factor that helps you, either you have a soft meat or you have a sealed oven or both, in either of those 3 cases, everybody holds that it's mutter. The only machlokas is in the case where you have both factors working against you. You have tough adult meat and you have an unsealed oven. And that's where the case with the machlokas is. And here again we have the kasha from the Mishnah that says that it is forbidden to cook meat over Shabbos, and this is not going to fit according to Rav Ashi with any case, because Rav Ashi holds that it is permitted in all four cases. So the Gemara will say that Rav Ashi will understand that this Mishnah is referring to where it's not in an oven at all. It's talking about where it's over open coals, and therefore it's more likely to stir meat than in our case where it's at least inside an oven. Okay. Now the Gemara goes to the discussion about selling an object to a goy on Shabbos, just before Shabbos, which we saw in our Mishnahs and Machakas between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai says that it's forbidden, and Beis Hillel says that it's permitted. Beis Shammai says that it's us because Beis Shammai says that somebody will see the guy carrying it out. He's going to think that you sent him on a mission for you, which is not allowed. And Beis Hillel says, no, people will understand that the guy is working for himself. Now, the Gemara quotes a version of this machlokes from a brisa, which is slightly different. According to this version, everybody agrees that there is concern that somebody might see the guy carrying an object and think that you gave him a mission. The only question is, how far does the guy have to be able to reach in order for the concern to be not an issue? According to Beis Shammai, he has to be able to reach his house. If he can reach his house before Shabbos, then you are not concerned that people are going to think that you gave him a mission to do for you on Shabbos. According to Beis Hillel, at least in our first version of it, he doesn't have to be able to reach his house, he has to be able to reach the city that he lives in. Because if somebody sees he reaches the city, they'll think maybe he lives in the first house in the city, even though he didn't have time to get all the way to wherever his house might be on Shabbos. And then Mark quotes Rabbi Akiva, who is explaining Beis Hillel, and he says, no, he doesn't have to be able to get to his city, he just has to be able to get out of the Jew's house. If he's out of the Jew's house, meaning people won't see him leaving the Jew's house on Shabbos, they won't be concerned that they won't assume that you gave him a mission to do for you on Shabbos. They will just assume that he's working for himself because he bought something from you or he borrowed it from you or something like that. Now the Gemara quotes a brisa on a related subject. Here it's not talking about Hilchos Shabbos, it's talking about Hilchos Chametz. So the question is, are you allowed to give Chametz or sell Chametz to a guy within 30 days of Pesach? Once it's within 30 days, it's time to start preparing for Pesach, and therefore you got to start getting rid of your chametz. So Beis Shammai says you can't give your chametz to a guy unless you're sure that it's going to be destroyed before Pesach. You have an obligation to destroy your chametz. Giving it to a guy is not destroying it, unless you know that the guy is for sure going to eat it. And Beis Hillel says no, as long as you're allowed to derive benefit from the chametz, you're allowed to give it to a guy. You do not have to destroy it. You only have to destroy chametz which is in your possession when the time of destroying chametz arrives. Then the Gemara quotes Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda apparently agrees with Beis Shammai, and he talks about a dish called kuta chabavli, which is a type of yogurt or sauce. It's made out of milk, sour milk. It's made out of moldy bread, which is very sharp and spicy. It had a lot of salt, and it appears in a lot of different halachos, this kuta chabavli. So it was a sauce, and therefore it lasted for a long time. It wasn't eaten straight. It was used as a condiment. So he says that you're not allowed to sell it within 30 days of Pesach, and not allowed to sell it to a guy, because he's not going to use it up within time for Pesach, and it contains bread. So therefore it is chametz. Again, he's following Beis Shammai's opinion that you are obligated to make sure that it gets totally eaten, and he says that it's not going to be eaten within 30 days. If, however, it is more than 30 days, so then you don't have to worry about the mitzvah of bir chametz. It hasn't started yet, and you're allowed to do whatever you want with it, including selling it or giving it to a guy.